friends. So, this session we're going to be exploring this idea of the feeling body. The feeling body. So, coming out of an introductory session on just getting to know tea, getting to know the plant, getting to know where it comes from, the varieties there are, just kind of wrapping around our mind around that there are so many varieties. There may be a lot of just things that come to the surface, just questions that lead to more questions, things we realize we didn't know, and all of a sudden it's just like, oh my gosh, there's so much that we can learn here, right? And so we want to honor, we want to observe what it is that we recognize it's coming up for us, recognize where the questions are. And like we did in our first class, kind of comparing like what part of our brain is that coming from? Is it coming from a step that may be missing somewhere, or something that we want to plug into as part of like a list? Like we understand part of this list, but we're missing these pieces, or the ways of organizing or understanding, because tea is it's a very fluid experience, especially for the people who grow and who produce tea. Almost any tea maker, I don't know any tea maker that I've ever met who would say these are the steps for making my tea. Most of the time when they describe how their tea is made, they could tell you some of the process and some of the steps, but they'll say that the way that they tell when something's done is by touching it, it's by smelling it, it's by observing it. It's a very soft answer, and often for visiting Westerners, it may feel like it's not enough, right? You want to feel like at some point when we start on this journey, we start with this idea that there's tangible, specific information about everything, and that it just keeps going that way. And the thing that is really curious, though, actually, is that as you keep going, the information gets fuzzier and a little bit more out of focus, a little less specific. The answer to everything tends to be, it depends. And that goes all the way down the chain, all the way to like the people who grow and produce tea and who descend from long lineages of producing tea. Everything is, I feel it with my hands, I smell it, I taste it, I just know from the experience of doing this every year. I can't describe to you how, I just do. And that gets a little confusing for folks who are expecting specific answers. And so in this session, I want to explore how we can work to bring this into balance, right? Because our need for structure and organizing, it is important, right? It serves a purpose, but it's not the only way that we should be learning. We should also be creating pathways to learn about our tea through our senses, through our bodies, and really taking that into the full weight and consideration for the importance that it serves. It is really, truly a big part of learning tea. And a lot of that can be beyond words, beyond kind of describing. So we want to create a way that we are being intentional about that, being intentional about what we bring into that space. So that's what brings us to this discussion about the feeling body. And let's take a look at the qualities of what the feeling body is seeking. So very different than the thinking brain that wants to put things in categories and in a chart and wants right or wrong answers and process for things. So generally, the body is seeking connections and possibilities. It doesn't want to just understand this step, then this step, then this step. It wants to understand how do those connect? And if I rearrange them in a different way, what else is possible? So connections and possibilities are a really big part. We see this a lot in our brewing practice, for example, as we start to get more connected and more, some might call this intuitive or natural with how we're brewing our tea, that we understand the connections that are being made. We understand I'm working with this type of tea right now, and so therefore it just needs this. Feeling body also appreciates time for absorption. This means going slower. This may mean doing less. And that can also feel funny if we're not used to it. This is the difference between going to a tea class where you're tasting, 8 or 12 teas and it's just very surface level kind of information about each one, versus we're going to do just one tea or two teas. Very, very slow. We're going to spend our time with it. And so that feels radically different. It can, if you're not used to it, I'll say it could arguably feel boring. It is okay at first to acknowledge the boredom. It's okay. It's actually never not okay, but just I say at first because that tends to be where it comes up. You know, things are slow. You're wondering, when are we going to get to it? You know? And then you get to it, you're like, how much longer are we going to be here? But the more we create the experience and the ability to be comfortable around something that takes a while, the more we realize we have learned from that. Time for absorption. It takes time to start to build these synaptic connections, to rewire some circuits in the brain, to work our neuroplasticity, where we're building new connections and new memories and new understandings of things. And then lastly, freedom for curiosity. Feeling body really appreciates the freedom for curiosity, to ask questions that may not have answers, and to recognize that the asking is really the important part. And why do you think asking is so important? If anybody wants to share in the chat, why is asking a question so important, even if it doesn't have an answer? Yeah, it triggers some curiosity. What else? What else does asking questions do? Yeah, we're truly thinking about it. It creates expansion and creativity around a topic. Leaves you free to experiment. It's beautiful. An acknowledgement of your own thoughts. Yeah. So you're an important part of this relationship with the tea. You know, it's not happening at you, it's happening with you. And so when you give yourself permission to ask those questions, you don't really need to know the answer. You just need to kind of verbalize out loud what your thinking process is. I'll also say, from my perspective as a teacher, I learned so much about my students based on the questions that they ask. I'm so much more curious about the questions that they want to ask than I am necessarily in that I need to feel that I provide them a concrete answer. Because it tells me about their thinking process, where the threads are going, what's most interesting to them, you know, what potential there is for us to explore. And so when you acknowledge that for yourself as as the learner, that's really powerful. So we definitely want to feel that we are in a space where we are creating the potential to do that, to just be curious, to not need to know. There is enormous freedom that comes from not needing to know everything. It's a bit scary too. It's definitely scary, especially for those of us who work in tea. It might feel like we need to know everything about it. But really, for those of us who work in any field, there's a lot of humility and freedom and expansion that can come from admitting what we don't know. And so that's a big part of this, of this work in tapping into with the feeling body. Bringing about the awareness that that's okay. The other thing that it's important to acknowledge why we consider this is a really obvious but often overlooked part of the tea experience is tea is a sensory, lived body experience. It's not a book subject. It's a sensory. So when we are interacting with our senses, our impressions, our feelings, memories, things that just naturally arise, we need to have space for that. And so sometimes in our education systems, in particular education systems around how we learn about tea, we don't really fully allow for that. And that is something that takes time, especially if it's not something that folks practice often. It really occurs to me quite a bit when people come to a tea class, if it's their first time ever tasting something with that kind of intentionality, how new that experience might be. Like if they've never, say gone to a cheese tasting or a chocolate tasting, all of a sudden people are drinking a tea and you're asking them, what kind of flavors do you get from that? If they've never done that, that's a big deal. That's a really big ask, right? So we need to create a way of having space for this. And that's really what this is meant by when we exploring the feeling body and what we're doing. So let's go ahead and start with this practice. So we're going to prepare 2 teas, 2 oolongs. We're going to do them both in teapot style and in bowl style. So just comparing the two side by side. Seeing how our impressions change between them. And so let's start with the lighter oolong tea. So if you have, like we included this weekend, was a baozhang, so kind of a greener, more perfumey tea, very light. It's actually one of the lightest oolongs. And make sure that our hot water is heating, and you could bring it to a specific temperature if you like. So we can do both of these teas somewhere around, maybe like 185 or so, 190. It doesn't have to be super hot, not boiling. Especially because we're going to be doing one of them in the bowl. And looking at your leaves, what do you see? So coming again back to color and shape and texture, getting your fingertips in your tea, and doing so in a way that is very slow, that's really noticing the texture of each one. Like noticing maybe some feel really soft, really brittle, really hard. There's a lot of twists or rolls. Be aware of not like poking at your tea. We're not doing this. We're not poking at it, jabbing it. We're actually feeling it. For tea professionals, those of us who are working in tea, when we are doing tastings at the cupping table and evaluating tea, largely we are using our hands and our fingertips. We're not using spoons. And over the years, repetition, that experience of just touching tea, you actually learn quite a lot about tea. Again, a lot of it's kind of beyond words. If somebody asks you what you specifically learn, it's like, well, I don't know. It's kind of hard to describe, but I know what a sencha feels like versus a longjing. I know what a roasted oolong feels like versus a very green unroasted oolong. I know what different black teas from this origin feel like. I may not be able to describe it, I know what they feel like. And so it's adding to that literal body of knowledge that you have about a tea. And so just notice your tea. Things like the texture on the surface. Some teas can have like this kind of silky, or sometimes might feel like a slightly oily, not like it's greasy, but like it's been softened sort of texture to it. And some might feel sort of powdery. If you're working with a white tea, for example, it often feels very fuzzy. Just notice. And then for comparison, pick up your other tea. So if you're working with the teas for this class, that would be the Fujian Rain, which is a type of Shuixian oolong, so it's roasted. So the leaves look really similar. They look really similar to Baozhang. They have a similar shape to them, but the color is different. Notice that it's a kind of a caramelly chocolate dark color. And then feel the leaves. What is their texture like? You might notice it feels a little bit more like woody, pine needly, drier. It's been roasted, so that makes sense. The texture doesn't have a kind of like that silkiness to it, just barely, that the Baozhang has. Just notice the difference between these, what they feel like. Adding that to your memory bank. And bring each one to the nose and smell. And when we're smelling, we really want the tea like up to the nose. As tea tasters, we would say that if you are coming away from it and you don't get some leaves on your nose, you're not close enough. So you gotta be like really close to it. And you're breathing in and out through your nose over the leaf. And while you're doing this, maybe paying attention to this slight external awareness of how your brain is processing this information. So try smelling them and seeing if closing your eyes is more helpful or focusing. You might also like to try keeping your eyes open but at a single point. So, like gazing at a single point. And that could be something specific that you choose. So, maybe if you have the package where the tea came from, you could look at the package so as to kind of like focus on the name. Or it could be on the teapot or the tea bowl that you're going to brew it in. But just something that's a steady focus rather than like looking around. Because when our eyes are in motion, our thinking is in motion, right? So either closing the eyes if that's comfortable or just gazing at something that is steady while you are breathing the tea. And then now switch and go back to the other one. Do the same thing. Notice just if there's a difference between eyes open or closed for you. And setting this tea down. And we'll go ahead and start with the lighter tea for our brewing, the lighter oolong, the baozhang. So begin first by, let's prepare the one that is in the teapot. We'll go ahead and weigh our tea just like we were doing for our first intro class. Just putting our teapot on the scale, measuring how much tea needs to go in for your size teapot. Again, using the fingertips and appreciating being able to use the fingertips. So at the cupping table, when we are evaluating tea, this is how we put tea in the little cupping sets. We just scoop it with our fingertips. There is, I must say, just enormous satisfaction when you get the correct scoop with one pinch. It is just this silly, yes, but really kind of just endearing connection of just understanding how much the scoop should feel like, and then you grab it on the first pull. It's really lovely. And then for our bowl, we're going to prepare the same tea in the bowl. And so here we're just going to take a little pinch of leaf. And it doesn't have to be the same size pinch as for your teapot. Usually for starting with a bowl tea, I recommend like thumb and first 2 fingers or so. Just a bowl that feels comfortable to hold between the hands. Doesn't have to be the same size as the teapot. You could put in more or less tea. Just notice what it's like to question how much tea you're putting in. You have the option to put in more or less. There's not a right or wrong. And then when you're ready, getting your hot water. And if you're still measuring or gathering what you need, it's okay. There's no rush. We take a long time with this. And we can start both teas at the same time. So the one that's the teapot will decant at like the normal time for an oolong. So something like 4 minutes, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, just kind of depending on how you like. And the one that's in the bowl, we're going to leave it in there to steep continuously. Let's go ahead and add in your water. Once you've got one, you can move to the other. And whenever you finish filling, just be mindful if you need to add more hot water to your kettle so we can prepare the other tea as well. It might take a little bit to heat that water. And so while your tea is brewing, you can just observe what's happening here in our bowl and in our pot, if our pot is accessible so we can see what's happening inside. And allow yourself to become curious about this process. So, especially sometimes we put tea in a teapot, it just kind of disappears in there and we don't really have a sense for what's going on. This could be something that brings up a little bit of nervousness about our brewing ability. If you like, you could open the lid of your teapot and just smell. This is something that when we are working with brewing tools like a gaiwan, for example, that's part of what makes it so, when we say it's accessible, that's what we mean, is that we can lift the lid and we can smell the tea. And we can use that aroma that's coming through to inform what's happening inside the pot. In other words, does it smell good? Does it smell like it's light? Does it smell like it's too strong? Just see what you notice as you're smelling your tea. And also, too, becoming comfortable with the idea that it's not a right or wrong. There's not a stop start. It's just kind of like this scale of increasing the volume and just noticing what's there. We can lift our tea bowl too, the tea that's steeping open in the bowl, and bring this to the nose. Noticing what we smell. Again, the oolong that's in the pot, you can leave that in there for about 4 minutes. Lighter oolongs are pretty gentle in this way. And just timing this in the way that works for you wherever you are in your brewing process. Just keeping an eye on the clock, the timer that you have going for your tea wherever you are. Turning your attention back to the one that's in the bowl. And if at any point you need to pause to decant your tea that's in the pot, please do so. But the one that's in the bowl, let's bring the bowl back up to our nose. And just like we did with the dry leaf, we're going to just breathe in the tea. We're going to notice what aroma is unfolding in the water. And just allow our brains to take a little bit of time to orient to this activity. Again, it may be a really new activity if you're not someone who smells and tastes in this kind of focused way for, a living all the time. It just takes a little bit. And experiment with what it's like to do this with the eyes closed or looking at a steady point, not looking around all over the room, but just inviting some quiet and some steady while you do this. And setting the bowl down for a moment. If your other tea is done brewing, go ahead and decant that tea or take out the infuser. And if it's ready to taste, we can go ahead and get a tasting cup ready and everything. But first, before we taste, we want to smell the leaves that are in the pot or in the infuser. Just taking off the lid, opening it, smelling what's inside. And there's a question here in the chat about the idea of not disturbing the leaves while they're brewing. I don't think that there's necessarily a right or wrong for that. It depends, as so much does with tea, it depends. If it's a really small broken leaf tea, doing so can make it can cause it to overbrew. Like little small pieces are going to extract flavor and color and aroma really quickly anyway, and because it's just so much surface area exposed. So agitating them in that kind of way can make it too much, make it too aggressive. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to do, but it's just not necessary. We're not, because if the idea of tea is to just let it slowly just open and just be whatever it's going to be, us stirring it or shaking the pot or somehow doing it is, we wonder like what are we doing and why? Like what would the purpose of that be? You know, sometimes folks do it because they're used to taking a tea bag and dunking to try to make the tea brew faster, right? The idea of tea is to go slower. So things that we're trying to do to speed up a process, you know, I always just encourage folks just become curious with why we need to go faster. And if that arises, that's totally fair. It's like it's worth asking something that sometimes maybe doesn't have an answer, and being able to sit with a question in a way that we can allow ourselves to just be open to, you know, not judging, right? If you need an experience to go faster, just observing where is that coming from in the body. Like, do I feel in general my day feels very busy right now? Or am I thinking about what's coming up later? You know, it doesn't have to be about the tea or me judging the tea or myself for wanting to go faster, just observing what it is and become curious about that. And so that's mindfulness at work right there. So it's not wrong per se to do that, but notice where it comes from and what we want to have happen instead. And I think that that's probably the more beneficial thing. So just notice about the leaves that are in the pot, what you smell. I like doing this exercise with oolong leaves because they're just so charming. They're so enchanting. They just smell so good. You just sit there and breathe. And so when you're learning how to breathe with a tea, it's a very natural one to try to do that with. When you're new to this kind of extended experiencing of aroma, sometimes it can be helpful to add a little count, maybe counting 3 or 5 in and out breaths to just ensure that consistently you are staying with the tea for a longer period of time. Because it's easy to speed up, especially when you're tasting multiple teas. Maybe you start out with the first one and then you get to the next one and it's just like, and then you move on. So maybe counting, 3 to 5 in and out breaths, and just feeling that slowness of the brain waves kicking in as you do so. But whenever you have reached a good amount of time of spending with that tea, of breathing in the leaves, give it a little taste. So tasting the one that is brewed in the teapot, just pouring yourself a little cup there. Noticing just the simplicity, just drinking a tea, connecting the through line of what we noticed in the dry leaves, that kind of first like a little bit of aroma that was there, and then what comes through in the infused leaf that we spent all that time really just breathing in and trying to understand. We spend time with it because we're trying to understand, and we're trying to understand something that sometimes doesn't really have the best words for it, so we just kind of have to feel it. And then we see that continue in through to the cup. So what's coming through in the cup that you notice. Just the simplicity of that. You don't have to describe it. You don't have to make tasting notes. You're not doing any copywriting for a company right now. Just tasting. Maybe just like rolling it around in the mouth. Noticing how the breath feels when you exhale afterward. That's such a beautiful part of tasting. You know, we really, especially oolongs, we smell and we breathe them for a long time afterward. So just notice as you breathe out, or if you're talking with a friend who's with you right now, just notice how like you smell the tea as you're talking. You smell it on your exhale. And then when you're ready, let's give the bowl tea a try. So picking up the one that's been sitting and waiting here patiently in our bowl, and taking a little sip from somewhere in the leaves. And noticing what is different about interacting with the tea very up close. So the leaves aren't removed from this process. They're in the water. They're right up under the nose as we're sipping. Notice the difference of the texture of the tea and the experience of unfiltered tea drinking when compared side by side with one that is brewed normally in a pot. So I really personally enjoy this style of brewing in a variety of ways. It's a variation on what is often called like grandpa style brewing, or I call it old folks style brewing, of brewing the tea just in a glass. It's how you would see tea enjoyed all over Asia. It's just pint glasses. People put leaf in it, add hot water, and then just kind of keep adding hot water. It's the most basic, everyday, pour yourself a cold one way of drinking tea. It's been the way that I've enjoyed tea for years, especially like when I first started out. I spent like a good decade walking around with like a jar. I found a photo of me actually the other day from about 10 years ago, when I first moved here to Chicago, and I was working for a tea company, and there's like, you could see on the table next to where I'm teaching a class that there's a jar of tea. Because it was just like my accompaniment was just my jar of tea all the time. And I was so drawn to this style of drinking tea because it is everything the leaf has to offer. And I can't control any part of that, really. Like, it's just going to be itself. And I found it to be such a helpful way of getting to know teas on an individual level, was to try them in that way before kind of trying to wrap my head around how I would shape that through a brewing process, because that is what regular brewing is. Brewing is an interpretation. It is you shaping the experience. It is you choosing the water temperature, the size of the vessel, how long to leave it in there, if you're going to re-steep it multiple times. And there's nothing right or wrong about either method. They're just interesting. You could use one to inform the other, right? Because only through like the brewing process, especially when you do gong fu brewing where you're steeping it multiple times, do you get this beautiful experience of seeing the flavor evolve, right? You don't get to see the flavor evolve quite in the same way when you're doing bowl style brewing, but it is a much more completeness of I think of it as like, here's the possibility of this tea. Here's everything that is possible that it can bring. And so often when I'm getting to know a new tea, this is kind of like my default way of making it, is I want to see how it is in the bowl before I try to interpret a brewing method for it. And so just see what you notice. Like, just first these two side by side, and then we'll try the Shuixian tea and see what we notice with that one too. There's a good question here in the chat about overbrewing with bowl tea. Not in my experience, honestly. I'll say no. You really can't. The only thing you could do possibly is add too much tea. Like, you add too much leaf, and then you just learn the next time to not do that. You can even fix it in the moment by just removing a little bit. Like, say if you added like a too big of a fluffy pinch, just take a little bit out and then keep going. You know, it'll correct itself eventually. But because it's an open surface and it's cooling as it's steeping, it can stay in there. Even green teas a really long time. I don't find that they get bitter at all. They really just mellow out. And so it's kind of cool how it creates this own little ecosystem of teeness in there, for lack of a better way of describing it, I guess. That I really enjoy. I think that's very neat. And my first years doing this were with green teas. I like Dragonwell was my staple tea of doing it, and Sencha was my staple tea of doing it. So two very different green teas, two teas that can become really pungent if you make them strong, and I found they were just fine. So yeah, I think that's one reason why I recommended, when we're doing a bowl, make sure it's just an open shaped bowl. If we want to use mugs, out of the cabinet, that's totally fine too. But I would suggest, I mentioned, don't use something with straight sides like my little coffee mug here, which does not have coffee in it, by the way. It has hot water and lemon. Not that there's anything wrong with coffee, but that would be, coffee and tea at the same time. It's just a little clashy. It just doesn't go well. But yeah, straight sides, it's going to retain the heat too much. So it's not going to cool off the way it should. And it's also kind of hard to get up to the leaves because the leaves are all at the bottom. You got all this water on top. You can't really get in there. Yes, Alex, cocoa. Cocoa sometimes, yes. Cocoa's good. But I have a different mug for the cocoa. This is the hot water and lemon one. But yeah, something with straight sides is a little trickier to work with in this method. You can, as long as you know what you're, you have an idea of what you're going to expect. It's okay. But when you're new to it and really want to get that face in the tea experience, a bowl is really helpful for that, I find. And so we'll just take like another minute or two with this first tea. Feel free to set aside any that you would like to keep sipping on later. So, pour into a little mug or something like that if you like. If you have a separate bowl that you would like to use, if you want to keep this one kind of going and move to another bowl, totally can do that. If you don't, you can just like scoop out the leaves, save a little bit of the tea if you like, and we'll get ready for the other one. But we'll sit with this one for like another minute or so, just being nice and slow. And seeing how the experience of this tea plays out closer now to the bottom of the bowl. Seeing what we're noticing as we get closer to the leaves. And, the impression that we may have of the tea may change. And that's kind of cool too, because it can start out as one thing and then become something else. And we get to sit with that different impression and ask ourselves, what's my takeaway here of this tea? And you can kind of go back and forth, but each one, tasting the one from the teapot, tasting the one in the bowl, and just seeing how they evolve, seeing how they change, particularly the one that's in the teapot. Notice how it's changed as it's cooled off. A lot of times oolongs really open up is the expression of describing that, which means they just kind of become more accessible, and we notice the softness of them more as they cool. So just see what you're noticing. I must say I'm really happy that bold tea in particular is kind of having this moment. It's is becoming a little bit trendy. Normally I'm not happy about trends, but this is one that I've been waiting 2 decades for, y'all. I mean, I've really been waiting for bold tea to have its moment. I'm happy about it because I think it's great for more people to consider simpler ways of brewing their tea and enjoying it. And, like I wanted to share here, this full awareness of why it's an important method to be aware of, what it's teaching you. It's not just simplicity, it's trying to teach you about the very nature of each tea one at a time, and then how you could use that to inform your own brewing recommendations for how you understand your other teas. And so let's go ahead and get ready for tasting the other tea. So we'll taste our Fujian Rain, our Shuixian Oolong, which is a lovely tea to consider for late spring, early summer. These really gently roasty oolongs. They kind of have this very mineral quality to them. It's very, very like fresh rain, hence the name of this tea. So we'll do this in the exact same way as the other one. So in the teapot and in the bowl, and just see what we notice that's the difference of the experience between the two. You may enjoy one of them brewed one way versus the other. So you're measuring with the fingertips, just like we did the first time, noticing how they feel as we're handling this tea. Really take advantage of whenever you can brew with your fingertips this way, do so. For some of us, depending on the work that we're doing, you know, obviously in serving tea at a tea house or a restaurant, we can't do this. But do this on your own when you can. Like I shared earlier, you know, professionals working in a tasting room, you know, at the cupping table, this is how we measure our tea. You know, we're very hands-on. We realize this is such an important part of our learning. So while we may not be able to do it for customers that we're working with, for food handling reasons, obviously, for our own learning and evaluation and how we train others, how tea tasters are trained. When I'm training people to taste tea on a technical level, yeah, we're using everything. There's no spoons here. We're getting very up in the tea. Same water temperature for this one. Now, it's fair to note that you could go higher in your water temperature with this one. And if you like, maybe you could do that for the teapot. I wouldn't recommend going really hot water with the tea bowl. It just takes a long time to cool off, especially this time of year in the summer. In the winter, that's totally fine. If you live somewhere where it's cooler climate, it works really nicely. But in the summer, it takes a long time, and it's very difficult to work with. So you don't have to go hotter for the one that's in the bowl. But you can make them both the same temperature. I'm making both of mine the same temperature. And we're going to do the same steep on the teapot as I did with the first one. So I'm going to do 4 minutes. So comparing the experience of this one to the previous one in the teapot, just how it performs, what I notice about it. This is how we start to get an understanding for what teas we enjoy brewed what way. You know how you'll hear folks talk about, oh, I like this teapot for this tea. And you're like, how would you even know that? Where does that information come from? Well, it comes from this. It comes from comparing them. One of my first mentors in tea actually had a saying that he would always use in training, that tasting is comparing. Tasting is comparing. You're not tasting something unless you're comparing it to something else. So that's why creating the possibility for us to be able to do this is really important. And we can be super creative about it. It can be different teas, different brewing methods, same brewing method across different teas, different temperature, just noticing what we feel. And so we're just watching what each one is like as we're brewing it, just noticing what's going on in the teapot, the different color that's there, maybe what the color reminds us of, different time of year. This type of oolong, the roasted oolong, is not only good for like springtime, early summer, but it's also really nice in the fall. You know, there's something about that earthy mineral quality. So another thing that we can do to help ourselves connect more intentionally with our tea is read into the between the lines of tasting notes. So when you see tea being described with often these very food-like terms, read into that a little bit more. Don't just think of it as like it just is what it is, but what is it implying? So if I have a tea that I'm describing it as being very woody, outdoors, mineral, kind of fresh rain, potting soil sort of quality to it, dried fruit. Maybe what are the things that come to mind? What kind of seasons come to mind? What sort of feeling does that evoke in you? What sort of other foods does that make you hungry for? Or clothes that you would wear? You know, that can often be a guide for the conditions that you might enjoy that tea the most. You know, so tasting notes are kind of interesting in that way. They're not just a factual description of something. It's a language that's reaching out to you. And when we talk about if something sounds appealing to you, that's kind of part of it is, you know, your needs, that time of year, what really strikes you, and how this tea might meet you where you're at. And so when we get these teas that really meet us where we're at for the mood, that's a really some like awesome learning happens too. And so just watching your time as your one in the teapot is brewing. Maybe same thing here too, lifting the lid, smelling the tea. Noticing what's different about this one compared to the other one in the teapot. And again, whenever it reaches 4 minutes for you, go ahead and decant that tea. Something that can be helpful too about brewing different styles of tea with the same temperature like this is we start to understand a little bit more. This discussion beyond this specific class, but we do have a lot of classes that cover the concept of energetics in tea. So how the tea itself, you know, the kind of energy it carries, what it feels like. And when you are keeping the brew temperature the same, you're controlling for something that would normally be an important variable, which is, well, this tea is brewed hotter, so therefore it makes me feel warmer, right? When you actually make for the temperature to be the same, you're controlling for that. So we're noticing then just on the similar base level how these teas feel differently when we're enjoying them this way. And that's also some really nice learning. It's really cool. So whenever your tea's done in the pot, again, just diving into the leaves in the pot, and spending the same time that we did with that first one. And again, maybe counting the breath is helpful. So 3 to 5 in and out breaths. Eyes closed or looking at something steady so that the thoughts are also starting to be a little bit steadier. And then when you like, smelling the one that's in the bowl. Same thing. 3 to 5 in and out breaths with the one that's in the bowl. And just notice where you feel sensation as you're smelling this tea, where your mind goes, where your thoughts go. You know, we're not trying to have no thoughts. We can't have no thoughts. We're living. So as long as we're living, we have thoughts. But just notice where they go. You know, where are you drawn to? Sometimes when we're smelling and tasting teas, often memories come up. That's a very natural part of the tasting process because our sense of smell is it's processed in the same area of the brain as one of the areas where we handle emotion and memory. So when we are smelling and tasting a tea, if you're taken to some place that you've been or a particular time in your life or food that you enjoy somewhere else, that's why, you know. And so that's another part of the language of tea when we're describing something. It doesn't have to be in these very technical, officially prescribed notes for something that somebody else. It's not somebody else's words, it's yours. Right? Tasting is it's personal. Our ability to detect certain things is even genetic. So this is why spending the time with appreciating your thoughts, your sensations, your associations is really valid. It's really important because no one else can speak for your tea experience other than you. You know, so you are talking for the tea through your own lens. So just notice what comes up to mind and what came to mind versus the first tea. You know, kind of where were your thoughts? Where were your feelings? You know, were you feeling energized or relaxed? Were you kind of like lulled away somewhere? You're feeling very grounded or earthy? You're feeling hungry? Just where were you there? And then as we go ahead and take a couple sips of this tea, maybe starting with the one at the pot if that one's done, where are you now with this tea? And so anytime that we switch teas, we move from one to the other. Sometimes that transition can be really quick, so we want to just take a moment to just recognize, literally remind the mind to orient itself like, okay, different tea, different thing, right? Different sensation. So the first sip maybe just kind of whoop goes by. So go back again. Maybe rolling it around a little bit. Get a sense for how the texture, mouthfeel is different. Notice as you swallow, what is your breath like with this tea? Is it different? Like what remains? What's that echo that remains with this tea compared to the other one? And we just taste as much as we need. So just kind of go back, be mindful if you don't want to over tea yourself, that's okay. And then whenever you like, let's try the one in the bowl. So first bringing to the nose, smelling what's there. And then taking a sip. And noticing the difference of sensation and lingering intensity between this tea brewed in the bowl and this tea brewed in a pot. And see if you can tell how the one that's brewed in a pot, this is like literally a filtered way of looking at this tea, right? Again, that's not a right or wrong assessment. It just is. The wholeness of it is what's in the bowl here. And a lens of it, a version of it, is what is coming through in the pot. I'm seeing a comment here in the chat. Yeah, the one in the bowl has so many more layers. Yeah. Like there's, and you can tell like there's, it almost feels to me like there's something that's beyond the bottom of it, Like I could tell where the bottom physically is in the bowl, but it feels like there's something more that's beyond that. And the one that's in the pot, even though it was brewed for a good 4 minutes, it's not so much about the duration of it, it's just the environment of the teapot itself. It's the fact that we removed the leaves. It's the conditions under which it was brewed with the lid on and everything like that. It's just, it evolved to create a different thing, I will agree with, Kira's mentioning the one in the pot is sweeter. Yeah, yeah, and I could see that. Do you notice? Anybody else notice it's sweeter, right? So it doesn't have as much texture to it, or as like woodsiness, or this style of tea I really like that it has this I would call it a resinous quality. So like tree sap kind of like dried tree sap. It doesn't have like this resinous quality that you really get out of the bowl. You get more of the sweet notes. This kind of light mineral quality, and that's what makes it refreshing. So you notice that in the pot versus in the bowl is like very earthy, going on a hike kind of thing. Yeah. And so it's just a noticing of not only the experience of how the two are different, but also where your needs are, right? And so that's why we respond to different teas and different brewing ways, and on different days, depending on our mood, depending on what our needs are. If we're tired, if we're hungry, if we're feeling alert, if we're feeling distracted, if we're feeling sleepy, learning to seek out ways of experiencing and being with the tea. They're really about ways of being with and experiencing yourself. And so that when you encounter differences in something, that we're not so quick to judging it. Like the differences between these two brewing methods in this one tea are not about that one is better, one is not, or that there's something wrong with the tea because it is this way here and not this way. It just is. It's just different. And that's important because it's a reflection of us too. Like we just are, you know, because you might need or want one thing one day and something different the next. You just are. That's okay. And so the tea is reinforcing that in a really positive way. It's getting in the background and doing that nice, good best friend work of reinforcing that message for you. Yeah, and interesting too, noticing that if there's like a difference between the two teas themselves, right? So the way that the Baojag, the first green tea or green oolong, showed that transition may be really different than how this tea does, right? So that's why it's important to consider having a variety of ways that we brew our tea and experiencing so you get a really clear idea of how it could represent and getting away from these ideas of this is the way this tea should be brewed, this is the only way to do it. You know, this is what happens when you play with that a little bit and give yourself that freedom to experiment. You learn something about the tea, you learn something about yourself and your own needs too in that process. So we're going to go ahead and take a little break here in just a moment here. But something I want to leave you with to consider before we meet up again is what does being with your tea in a looser, less rule following way bring up for you? Positive, negative, or neutral? Just like what are some things that you are surprised about, either with the tea or with yourself in brewing this way? And we'll chat a little bit more about that in our next session.